Hi, we continue in Genesis 47 today as Joseph has prepared his brothers and his father for meeting Pharaoh and has gone into Pharaoh and brought 5 of his brothers with him to propose that they settle in the land of Goshen. And now we'll hear Pharaoh's response. And as we do, we've been noting throughout this little unit, which you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following these sections here. And we note that today's unit here, in a little compressed writing because I had to squeeze it into this little marginal section, ends here in verse 12 where we'll end today, and then picks up after the amazing story we'll look at next time of Joseph managing famine for a profit. So as you can see, if I scroll out here in the distance, we're going to be looking at this section here, and it ends with providing for his family. And then after this whole thing about making everybody in Egypt slaves, it continues, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. So that's where we are. And the fact that story about Joseph managing famine for profit is inserted right in the middle ought to put a great chill on readers, ancient readers and modern readers. Some have dismissed that, as we'll see when we look at an older scholar like Westerman, who sees it as an insertion from another source. And it certainly is an insertion, but it does not have to be in any way from another source. And as we'll see, and you can see on the right side from the language here that we've been looking at with the key words, the same key words are in this passage, which is the supposed insertion, that are in this section before and after. So the language is consistent throughout. It's an insertion in the way that biblical stories put insertions. We see it, for example, in 1 Samuel 25, where David goes to Nabal there in between the stories of him escaping from Saul. And we saw it here in Genesis in chapter 38 with Judah and Tamar in between the story of Joseph and his brothers and his dreams. And we saw how well it fit there. So it fits well here. And what it tells us is that for all the gift and blessing and wonderfulness of what's sounding here, it's a very ominous thing that's happening. That Joseph, in the name of Pharaoh, if not in the name of God, is calling his family to abandon the covenant that his ancestors made with Yahweh, to put them in the land of Canaan, and to settle long-term in the land of Egypt. And they will settle long-term in the land of Egypt as slaves until Moses comes along several hundred years later, according to the book of Exodus, and liberates them, which they're hesitant to do after they've been slaves for so many generations. So this ought to look ominous to us, and certainly the authors of these chapters, putting them here either as part of the Joseph story all along or at the end, and certainly as I've been showing with the bridge into the beginning of Exodus with the list of the names of Jacob's sons, certainly are anticipating that this is what leads to Exodus. The Exodus story itself does not have an origin story of how Israelites ended up enslaved in Egypt. This provides that. So we ought to be extremely suspicious of what's going on here. And to the extent that it sounds celebratory, well, empire makes its offering celebratory, but there's always a price to pay. And the price, as the Egyptians will see in the next passage, is nearly everything. So as we look at this scene, Pharaoh says to Joseph, and let's just note for a moment here that what it's like for the brothers and Jacob, who will be brought in just a moment, we see in verse 7, to speak before Pharaoh. After all, the leader of the greatest empire in the ancient world, something could only have been mythical. And perhaps it's like Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man going to see the Wizard of Oz and entering the Emerald City. And here they are talking directly to Pharaoh, even though they're literally nobodies other than the fact that they're the family of Joseph, who is kept Pharaoh's in power and safe during the famine and is about to enrich him beyond, I'm sure, even Pharaoh's wildest imaginations. So that's what's going on here. And we have to wonder as well, in this conversation between Pharaoh and Joseph, of how much they talked ahead of time. I mentioned that last video, that it seems unlikely that Pharaoh didn't know that Joseph's family was coming until they arrived right there. And I'd like to suggest that Goshen was a plan on the part of Pharaoh and Joseph together to put them in Goshen. So as we saw last time, when Joseph told his brothers, this is what I'm going to say, and this is what you say, and then Pharaoh will say and ask, what is your occupation? That's exactly what Pharaoh does. Perhaps that's just a generic thing to say, hey, what do you do? But that's all that Pharaoh does in this scene. He doesn't ask anything about what life is like in Canaan. He doesn't ask anything about them. He doesn't even ask about their father. He asks that one thing. They say what they want, to reside as aliens. Notice, not to come permanently, simply to reside there as long as the famine continues. They're not anticipating that they're going to be there long term. And Joseph didn't suggest they would be, although sort of he did. He said, you may settle in the land, and settling is ambiguous. There are places that Jacob settled, for example, in Shechem, which didn't work out so well, but of course he didn't settle there long term because of what happened to the Shechemites after the rape of his daughter Dinah. And so it's ambiguous here, but we'll see what Joseph says. It becomes less ambiguous and therefore even more ominous. And as we saw just while we're on this Goshen last time, and we saw all of this, the offering of Goshen. Notice the brothers never mention Goshen. It's just coming out of Joseph's mouth. And then Pharaoh affirms it. And then we'll see right after the end of the Joseph managing famine for a prophet is they settled in the region of Goshen. And so that's all being set up as if it was natural and as if it was a gift. But is it or isn't it? We have to look and see. So here we are. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, as Wenham notes below, although the brother spoke to Pharaoh, he responds to his minister, quote, suggestive of courtly decorum, that he speaking through the one he knows. But what he says is absurd because obviously they're right there, although the father's not there yet. We don't know that specifically, but we'll find that out in verse 7. But they're right there. The brothers are right there. Your father and your brothers have come to you. And as Westerman notes, picking up on what we heard in 46:31, but which not apparently spoken to Pharaoh, which is just one of those little hints I'd like to suggest that Pharaoh and Joseph planned this ahead. Why should that not be? After all, Joseph is planning it ahead with his brothers, so why would he not plan it even more ahead with Pharaoh? But we just don't hear that. And so here's what Pharaoh adds to this. And my note below has the chiasm, which I extended here to verse 5, so we can ignore that. The land of Egypt is before your face. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Now, although it uses the word Matov here, which is only here in the chiastic parallel in verse 11, it certainly ought to echo what we saw in chapter 23 when Abraham was negotiating with the Hittites, when they said, bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places, and then Abraham argues with them about it until they finally reach a price there. And the point being there, that this was the kind of quote-unquote negotiation that happened in the ancient world. The first thing you say is, take whatever you want, and then they know that, okay, we got to get down to something in particular. So it starts with the generic in the best part of the land, but then it goes directly to Goshen. Why should Pharaoh say Goshen other than the fact that Joseph said Goshen? As we saw last time, and here's another view of it, Goshen is far from the Nile, but it's also far from Alexandria. And although Alexandria is never mentioned here in the book of Genesis, it would be anachronistic if it was, having been built by Alexander the Great and his successors in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. It perhaps is the provenance of when the story was written, and that the Egyptian Ptolemies, the descendants of Alexander, are the Egyptians at issue here. And so to the extent that that's what's at issue, Alexandria would have been the capital, and Goshen would be a long way from Alexandria, and also a long way from the Nile. Although it all looks green on Google Maps, that's because modern irrigation allows it to all be green. And although the Nile Delta certainly isn't just a one main river, it has a number of tributaries, hence the delta. The farther you are from those tributaries, the harsher it would have been in the ancient world, unless you had slaves, which is what allowed the Egyptians to do it and Pharaoh to do it. But Jacob and his family don't have their own slaves. They'd have to become the slaves, and that's the issue. Although we don't have any reason to think they're going to practice agriculture, they just need crops and to have fodder for their animals, and that's what they're going to get in this land. And they're going to get it for longer than they thought. We'll see that next time. So let them live in the land of Goshen. And then he adds this, if you know there are capable men, or literally men of power or of strength, which in a monarchy context is used for soldiers, put them in charge of my livestock. And as Wenham notes below, the office of quote-unquote royal stockman is, quote, mentioned frequently in Egyptian inscriptions. And Ramesses III is said to employ 3,264 men, mostly foreigners, in this post. Foreigners would certainly be an element both of just mercenary elements of hiring foreigners, as David hires foreigners to be his soldiers throughout, but also to be associated with something that's an abomination to the Egyptians, which is hanging around with the livestock and the dung and all that stuff. So that's what Pharaoh says, and now Joseph brings in Jacob. And it's only now that we realize that Jacob wasn't in the room. We'd been told that he brought in 5 of the brothers, and we saw that up here, but we didn't know why the 5. But we didn't really have to think about that he didn't bring Jacob in. And so now we realize it must just be like in an anteroom or a waiting room. They can't be in a different place, but we don't know what the place is. They're plainly not in Goshen right now. but where they are, we're not told. And perhaps that's, again, to allow the story to fit the audience's world and also fit the story world, which don't exactly fit together if you put in the details. So Joseph brought in his father Jacob. Notice he's Jacob here and not Israel. He's Jacob throughout this whole scene here, distinguishing him from the emerging sense of Israel as the nation. He presented him before Pharaoh, or literally stood him in the face of Pharaoh, as I have it on the right side. And then this amazing thing happens. Out of nowhere, the first thing that happens here is Jacob blessed Pharaoh. We don't know exactly what that means. There's no words given or gestures. We don't know if he raised his hand in blessing or if he called upon Yahweh. Nothing is said about that, but it'll frame again, as you can see in verse 10. Westerman notes below, Jacob enters Pharaoh's presence as a foreigner, a shepherd from the steppes, who through the mediation of his sons has to beg the Pharaoh's minister for bread. It is this incongruity that gives this blessing its peculiar character and dignity. And he goes on to say, it is no mere chance that the final words are spoken in an audience with the Pharaoh. His closing audience is a silent witness to the positive value of the monarchy. That's how Westerman sees it. And I want to highlight that in the face of what I've been saying, because many of those scholars often saw monarchy, as they see the central governments of their own nations, as a benefit. Even if some of the office holders may be corrupt, overall, it provides benefit. Is that really the case here? We have to decide whether Westerman's right or whether we disagree. But here, the idea of this nobody blessing Pharaoh, as we've been noting throughout Genesis, the Genesis, it's a blessing, is fertility and life. More children, more animals, more crops. And this is in the midst of a famine. So what is that saying that nothing is commented on? Instead, Pharaoh seems to ask a trivial question. Instead of saying, how have you blessed me, or thank you, or anything, he says, how old are you? How many are the years of your life, or literally the days and years of your life? As Westerman notes, this is not a matter of mere courtesy, it's an act of sharing, binding for a moment the house of Jacob and Egypt. But how is it sharing? Pharaoh doesn't say how old he is. We don't even know Pharaoh's age or name. And we never hear the Pharaoh's names in Genesis or in Exodus, although we do in the monarchy story. The one who deals with Solomon's son Rehoboam, and the one who deals with Josiah a few centuries later. But we don't hear the names here. So Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the years of your life? And here's what Jacob has to say. And we recognize that when he thought Joseph was dead, he was whining about Joseph being gone. He was whining about Benjamin. Fair enough, his two sons of his beloved wife Rachel. But now he's got them all together, and it's all shown to be not true, and he ought to be happy, oughtn't he? He's been reunited with his son, and this is what he has to say. The years of my earthly sojourn are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life. Let's look a little more closely. The word for sojourn, which is twice in the verse here, Maguri, notice the gur there, the same thing for an alien, or Hagar for a foreigner there. So when the brothers said to Pharaoh in the previous scene, we have come in order to live as aliens in the land, it's highlighting the temporary element. Jacob is now saying his whole life has been a sojourn, that he's never been settled in one place. And he described it as 130, as Sarna notes, thus making 290 years from the exodus from Haran, not the exodus from Egypt, but Abram and his family going from Haran down to Canaan and now down to Egypt. And we'll find out that Jacob will live to be 147, so 17 years that he lives with Joseph in Egypt, and 17 years he lived with Joseph in Canaan. The word for hard is evil here. So few and evil have been the years of my life. It's not just that he's saying it's difficult, like it might have been when he said to Laban how hard it was caring for the sheep in winter and summer and the hot sun and the cold, but that it's been evil. And we can certainly imagine he's experienced some evil, but he's also got, as far as we know, a completely healthy family. One daughter got raped and a wife has died, but the others are alive, and given child mortality in the ancient world, to have all your children live into adulthood is astounding. And yet he sees his life as short and evil. And because they do not compare with the years of the life of my ancestors. And isn't that something? Is it just he's comparing my life's nothing compared to Abraham and Isaac's? Or is he being modest here? Or is he celebrating the fact that his family has come from a line with what we might call good genes? It also suggests doing exactly what he's suggesting, comparing the lifespans of Abraham and Isaac. And when we get to Jacob's death, we'll compare 147, 180, and 175. Shh, don't look it up and cheat. All right. So then Jacob blessed Pharaoh again, And my note has the absence of hospitable meal reminds readers that despite his power, Joseph's family is doubly abhorrent to Pharaoh as shepherds and as Hebrews, which is to say we heard in chapter 43, it's an abomination for the Egyptians to eat with what they called Hebrews, crossers, migrants, aliens, immigrants, and so they don't. And so he's telling them to go settle in this land, which he calls best, but one could see as marginal. It's perhaps as a real estate agent, which is what Joseph is presented as here, says, this is the greatest house in the neighborhood. But is it? So let's hear this verse here. Joseph settled his father and his brothers. And settling again suggests they're going to be here for a while, but it doesn't determine that. But this does. And granted them a holding. Aktuah here, as it was in 17:8, was God's promise to Abraham that I would give you a holding in this land. In chapter 24, it's a negotiation with the Hittites. In 36, it's Esau's land. And in 48, it'll be Jacob reminding everybody, including Pharaoh, that Yahweh promised him a holding in Canaan. And then in 49 and 50, both Machpelah, the cave where he wants to be buried. So the actual place everywhere else is in Canaan, or more particularly in Machpelah, for the dead bodies, not in the land of Egypt. Is Joseph acting as God here, or is he acting as a later audience might say as Satan, tempting them to abandon Yahweh and the covenant and to settle long-term in Egypt? And notice in the end here, not in the land of Goshen, but in the land of Ramesses, which is exactly the place that they will be building as a storage city in Exodus 1:11, and the place from which they'll leave in 12:37, which suggests it's anachronistic here in a number of ways. The actual capital of Ramesses was built in the 13th century BCE, but when the Nile branch that fed it silted up, the capital was moved 62 miles to the northwest, and it was revived under Pharaoh Shishak in the 10th century BCE, but that's not the time period of this story. That's the time period of the monarchy, which would be hundreds of years later. So in the time period of the story world, Ramesses probably didn't even exist. It's anachronistic there. And again, Exodus says they built it precisely as a storage city, perhaps because they were already there. And so that ought to be a dire warning to us that Goshen, the larger area, has now been substituted for the very specific place, not called a city here, called a land, but will become the city of Ramses, named for an older pharaoh. As Pharaoh had not instructed, but had ordered. And that really highlights that what sounded like an invitation, I'm offering you as a gift the best land in the country. Aren't you lucky to have Joseph to be your real estate agent on your behalf? But now it's an order. So it's not an invitation. They've come here and now they're ordered to settle there. And the question will be, how will they ever get out? We'll see. More of that because they will be out before Genesis is done, but then back again. So our story ends today with Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food. There seems to be plenty. Literally bread, lechem here, last at 45:23, but 5 times in 47:13 to 19, the scene that follows that we'll see next time. According to the number of their dependents, which is an abstraction from the Hebrew, which is much better as I have down here, or I have up here, the number of their children's mouths, almost like baby birds in the nest there. So how we make sense of the fact that Joseph seems to have plenty of food to provide here, and yet in the next verse we'll see there's no food in the land. We'll go to that incredible scene next time. See you then. Bye-bye.